we tend to desire to be free. I do think, however, that people can become complacent and not want to take responsibility for their lives and hope that the government will take care of things for them.
I am a husband, a father, a lawyer, a Christian, and a proud Canadian. I started this series because it was clear that our nation needs truth. Not just another biased narrative, but real information of substance. We need access to facts and the freedom to think for ourselves. I'm Leighton Grey, and this is Grey Matter.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Grey Matter. Well, as you know, we like to have great authors on the show, and I think we really do have one here today. His name is Mark Gober, and he's written a series of books which treat profound questions in a highly readable way and also offer practical, real-world solutions to complex questions. There's 6 of his books and all. We're going to talk a little bit about them. I've been able to get my way through 3 of them, and I've really enjoyed them. Looking forward to having our discussions today with Mark Gober. So, Mark, thanks for being on the program today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate that you took the time to read several of the books.
Yes, they're the 3 I've read are wonderful, including the most recent one, which is entitled "An End to the Upside Down Reset: The Leftist Vision for Society Under the Great Reset." But I noticed, and we can get into this a little bit, I noticed that there are some really interesting recurring themes in the books that I read that might be a great way to frame and talk about your work. Before we dive in and introduce our guest properly, as we always do, we've got some framing aphorisms. One of them is from a man named Eric Hoffer, who wrote, "In a time of drastic change, it is the learners who inherit the future. The learned usually find themselves equipped to live in a world that no longer exists." Next one is from Richard Dawkins, a renowned atheist, who wrote, "By all means, let's be open-minded, but not so open-minded that our brains drop out." And from Hippocrates, who wrote, "The greatest medicine of all is teaching people how not to need it." And from a man who we're going to talk about a little bit in terms of our guest's most recent book, Klaus Schwab, who said that the pandemic represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world. So, who do we have in the show today? Well, his name is Mark Gober. He's the author, as I said, of this most recent book about the Great Reset, but he's also written a book called An End to Upside Down Thinking. That's from 2018, which won the IPPY Award for Best Science Book of the Year. He's also the author of An End to Upside Down Living, which is one of the ones that I've read. An End to Upside Down Liberty, I've also read that one. An End to Upside Down Contact, An End to the Upside Down Reset, which I've read, and An End to Upside Down Medicine, and An End to the Upside Down Cosmos from 2024. He's also the host of his own podcast, which is called Where Is My Mind? Additionally, he serves on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Previously, Mark was a partner at Sherpa Technology Group in Silicon Valley and worked as an investment banking analyst with UBS in New York. He's been named one of IAM's Strategy 300, the world's leading intellectual property strategists. Mark graduated magna cum laude from Princeton University, where he wrote an award-winning thesis on Daniel Kahneman's Nobel Prize-winning prospect theory and was elected a captain of Princeton's Division I tennis team. Wow, quite a resume. Well, Mark, it's great to have you here on the program. I want to start off talking about your most recent book that you've written about the Great Reset. And this is something that we have talked about on our program before, but I gained a much deeper understanding of the Great Reset from reading your book. Could you provide maybe a thumbnail sketch of what the Great Reset is and why those of us in the West who cherish things like freedom and liberty and personal property should be worried about it?
Well, the Great Reset was a formal announcement in 2020. I think it's important to start there because sometimes that term is thrown around with the words conspiracy theory after it.
Right.
But it's not a conspiracy theory. This is a stated vision for society conceived by the World Economic Forum and its partners around the world. The formal announcement was initially by Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum alongside then Prince Charles in June of 2020. And this was during the height of COVID at the beginning. And they said, now this is a time for a great reset. The next month, Klaus Schwab and one of his colleagues published a book called COVID-19, The Great Reset. And in that book, it lays out what the Great Reset actually is. It's a vision for society, and this perceived emergency of COVID-19 was an impetus that would allow society to be reshaped, basically. And that's the container in which they describe it. And what I try to do in the book is to break down in plain language what they're actually talking about. Because if your audience members pick up the book, COVID-19, The Great Reset, which anyone can do, the language
Right.
is very positive and compassionate. It sounds like they're going to make the world a better place. But I try
Mm-hmm.
to show that it's really a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Mm-hmm. And you really do an excellent job of that. And one of the things as Canadians, as much of our audience is, and you really do an excellent job of talking about this in your book. There's a reference in your book to Klaus Schwab really announcing that the Canadian cabinet, Justin Trudeau, who's really an avatar for all things woke and for the World Economic Forum, his entire cabinet had been infiltrated. Those are Klaus Schwab's words, by the World Economic Forum. Another thing that was really astonishing, I did not know before, was that Vladimir Putin was part of the World Economic Forum's, Young Leaders program. So there's really some astonishing information in there about the Great Reset. It has particular application for Canada, and as you know, as you point out in your book, unfortunately, what we've been living through in Canada is really the practical iteration of World Economic Forum policies for these many years. And really, Canada is a bit of a case study for really how awful the World Economic Forum policies are. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and I think that what's important here is we're discussing a phenomenon that is worldwide. The World Economic
Right.
Forum is outside of any government, but as Klaus Schwab has said explicitly, we penetrate the cabinets, meaning that people who have the ideology of the World Economic Forum, whether they're young global leaders or otherwise, it's people who have the ideology or who have exposure to it, they are within governments all over the world, including Canada, where seems to be a high concentration. So
Mhm.
it's a non-governmental party infiltrating the governments, which then get to dictate the laws to the people. So this is something that everyone, I think, should be paying attention to. That's why I wanted to write about it, because if we're aware of what's going on, it's somewhat easy to see through. But if we're not aware of it, then the things happening in the world seem a bit more random.
Mhm. Now, Mark, I want to talk about you particularly in terms of your background as an author. Obviously, very well educated person, Princeton graduate. What drew you to not only this particular subject, but also to writing this series of books? There's six books, and I expect there's going to be a seventh. I hope there is. I'm going to read the other three, but there's a series of books with this title, "An End to the Something." What sort of drew you to this? What was the impetus for this way of expressing yourself in your literature?
As I was working in Silicon Valley, this was back in 2016, I became exposed to topics initially through podcasts, but then I started to read books independently and read scientific papers. So these were topics that really blew my mind in terms of the nature of reality. And it started off with that. What's the nature of consciousness? What does it mean to be a human being? Is there an afterlife? Are psychic phenomena scientifically established? And I came across some very astounding findings, which shifted my whole life. And I was so impacted by it that I wanted to share it with others. And I was hoping that because I had a more traditional background and I felt like I could back what I was saying with credible sources. In that case, I was referencing the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies at the medical school, the US government's declassified documents, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Princeton University. If I could compile that very credible data into a book, maybe I would reach new audiences with this material and positively impact people. And at the time, I thought that was it. An End to Upside Down Thinking was the first book, and I'm just going to continue in my job. But that's not what happened. I got pulled even further. I actually left my job about 5 years ago. So, right when everything with COVID started, I decided to leave, or actually right before that. And I've continued writing. And actually, the most recent one is the seventh. I always tell people I'm not sure if I'll write anymore, but we'll see.
Well, the books that I've read, the three that I've read, are wonderful. And a few things I really like about them, and obviously you've taken care to do this. They're extremely well organized. You do a really great job of identifying the subject matter, identifying the issues, and then going into some detail to explain what are really complex issues. And the other thing that you do very well, which is not an easy trick as a writer, I know this from experience, is trying to take things that are complex and sophisticated, and not falling into the trap of sort of trying to sound really smart and explain them, but actually bringing them down to a level where everybody can understand them. And so, in reading your books, I would say that on a level of somebody who is very well educated on a PhD level, but even someone who is in high school would be very fascinated and be able to understand the things that you're talking about. That took some effort, I would expect, on your part.
Well, first, thank you so much for saying that and for noticing, because these are conscious decisions that I make when I write. And I think a lot of it comes from my professional career, especially what I was doing in Silicon Valley, because I had to take a lot of complex material in the realm of intellectual property. So, dealing with complex new technologies and translate that to a board of directors or a senior management team that needs to know the information at a basic level so they can make decisions. Maybe they don't have the technical expertise, but they want the resources if needed to go into those details. So I was very accustomed to having to do this on a daily basis in a different realm. So I took the tools of what I did professionally and said, wow, there's a way to use this to communicate to people. And I am trying to be able to communicate to all ages with these books.
Hmm. Well, I think you're doing it successfully. And the other thing I really enjoyed, and I don't want to offend the Puritans out there who think that books should only be read with the actual a book in your hand. I experienced your three books as audiobooks, and I really enjoyed the narration of them. This is something I don't know if you are a person who's a fan of audiobooks, but I really enjoy having the book read to me by the author, because I find I get a better sense of the inflection of just the emotion and the ideas that the author is getting across. And so I tend to not listen to audiobooks if they're not read by the author. But the three books that I listened to were read by you. And I found I really that was a very enjoyable experience. What was your experience of doing the narration? Did you find that tedious or did you enjoy it?
Well, I have read the audiobook for every single book so far, and this was a suggestion by my publisher, Bill Gladstone. He said many people want to hear from the author, and I also find for me, it's a good way to do a final read of the book when I have to
Mm.
read every word, and I end up making small changes when I'm in the studio. But in many ways, it's extremely tedious because I'm reading every word. And then when I listen to the recording, I say, I don't like the way I did that. Then I go back in the studio and change it. You can only imagine how many little tweaks there are, or there's a noise in the background. We have to fix that. But I do find that a big percentage of my readers are listeners.
Hmm.
And you can change the speed on Audible. So if you want to go a little faster, there are ways that people can absorb information in a busy life with Audible.
Yes, yes, very flexible. I recently read a quotation from James Earl Jones, who actually said, and of course, he had one of the most unmistakable voices ever, so one of the best narration voices ever. And he said he didn't like to listen to the sound of his own voice. So hopefully, you're not in the same category. Uh, what I'd like to do, if I could, is to identify three main themes that I kind of picked out that ran through the three books that I read, and maybe get you to comment on these. I thought this would be maybe an interesting way to frame some of your ideas that you've written about. One of them that shows up, and I should say that the three that I read are An End to the Upside Down Liberty, An End to Upside Down Living, and An End to the Upside Down Reset, all of which excellent books. But one of the themes that comes through, Mark, I wanted to ask you about this, is the sort of materialism versus transcendent reality, kind of scientism versus meaning. It seems to run through when you're talking about things like liberty, talking about thinking, talking about living, and also talking about the Great Reset. These two ideas sort of come through as being in conflict. You want to talk about that a little bit?
And this is actually where I started with an end to upside down thinking. What do I mean by upside down thinking? I'm referring to the materialist view of reality. This is a metaphysical perspective. In other words, a container for the way reality sits. So, anytime we're talking about something within science or politics, we're assuming it's within some reality more broadly. And that broader reality that much of the world, let's say much of the educated world today, subscribes to is known as scientific materialism, which says that everything can be reduced to physical stuff that we call matter. And
Mhm.
it's from matter, and especially the random interactions of matter after 13.8 billion years following a Big Bang, that random interaction of matter has led to the development of a human being, which develops a brain. And it's from our brain that we develop the consciousness that gives us experience. So everything starts with matter, and we end up with our consciousness, our experience at the very end. Whereas I don't know what the exact correct metaphysics is, but there are many holes in materialism, which I go through in the books. I lean towards something that's the reverse of materialism without knowing exactly how it works, where there's something about awareness, some might call it God, that is fundamental, and the material world and physics and human beings and brains all fit within that. And
Mhm.
that's a general framework that tends to be compatible with many spiritual and religious traditions, even though within traditions there are different differences in the nuances. But we're talking about something that's random, meaningless, godless, that's materialism, versus meaningful, higher intelligence, purpose to life, afterlife. That's the
Mhm.
alternative. And so the metaphysical container that I now lean toward, and this is why my life shifted, because I was much more of an atheist agnostic. And now I think there is a spiritual reality that we're all a part of, whether we like it or not, or whether we realize it or not.
Right.
And if that's true, if we live as a part of a spiritual reality, then that means every discipline has to be reconsidered. So that's how it flows into how do we think about politics and economics and the Great Reset.
Mhm. There was a great YouTube conversation that was recorded between Dr. Jordan Peterson, who's mentioned in your book, and Dr. Roger Scruton, who's also mentioned in a couple of your books. And they were talking about the meaning of transcendence and the importance of transcendence for humanity across a number of different metrics, in terms of, as you say, finding meaning in your life. Why do why do humans want to be free? Why is the family structure so important to human flourishing? And I really like the way you get at some of these topics in your book, in your books, I should say, because these are themes that run through several of your books, what you just talked about. And when we're talking about the Great Reset, what you're really talking about is a reset to this materialistic view of life, aren't we?
Absolutely. When I was reading The Great Reset, I was thinking, oh, we're talking about a reset. And I've been writing for a while about how we need to shift a metaphysical paradigm. And it was conspicuously absent from the literature, talking about a metaphysical recontextualization. That's not what this was about. And in many ways, that's an implicit nod toward materialism. And when we combine that with a lot of the rhetoric, like the transhumanistic perspective, uh, things that Yuval Noah Harari has said, who's a
Mhm.
leading advisor for the World Economic Forum, he's said things like the idea of a soul or spirit, that's over.
Mhm.
So this is something that is underlying the Great Reset that I don't see talked about quite as much. Of course, there's the authoritarian aspect of it too, but there's something that's materialistic philosophically that's embedded in it as well.
Mhm. And you talk a lot about this concept of transhumanism, which ties into another one of the themes in your books, and that is this idea of individual liberty, individual value and responsibility versus collective control and safety. And the Christian idea of the intrinsic value of human life is that we are is the imago Dei, that is, we are made in the image of God, and that therefore we have intrinsic value, and that our natural rights sort of flow from that. Transhumanism really attacks that, doesn't it? It says that, well, there really isn't anything unique about being human. In fact, it's just another sort of a progression of this materialism that you talk about in your books. Would you
And it
agree with
almost, yeah, I think it's a good way of putting it. It almost puts the leaders of the world in the position of God, where they can tinker with humanity in whichever way they see fit because they seem to know what's best. It's a very much an elitist and anti-human perspective, is the way I describe it in the Reset book.
Hmm.
Whereas if we live in this other metaphysics I've discussed, where there is a higher intelligence, God, then that would be the force that has created all. And so
Hmm.
that deference is not there within the Great Reset mentality.
Hmm. And this theme that's in your Great Reset book is also talked about in your book on liberty, and this conflict between individual liberty, which entails responsibility, versus collective control and safety. There's a famous Benjamin Franklin quotation, which I think is in your book, about how we give up a little bit of liberty for some security. We end up with neither, and so that theme, the concept of having individual liberty and responsibility versus collective control and safety. That's another theme that's talked about in your books, and is really an important one that perhaps isn't talked about enough.
And the way I look at liberty now is that it's innate within us. We are inherently free beings that are part of this higher consciousness that's the basis of all creation. And
Hmm.
so to think that someone will give us liberty and that's an accepted and really just a status quo element of society is a distortion.
Hmm. Hmm. You also go into some detail talking about, well, what at what price liberty? What does that mean? What responsibility does that place on the individual? Do we really need government? Do we need less government? Would we be more free with less government? These are all really interesting topics that are treated in your book. And I think what you're trying to get at is getting people to think about, okay, I'm really comfortable in my life driving my Tesla down the road, sipping my Starbucks, but what am I really doing? Am I free? Will I actually be happy when I own nothing? These are these are really serious things to think about. And what I like about your books is you're very thought provoking. Get people thinking outside of maybe the comfort zone that we're living in right now. Was that one of the goals of your books?
Absolutely. I
Absolutely.
think all of the books, hopefully, are designed to help people ask questions about things they haven't questioned before, perhaps. So,
Hmm.
questioning things they might have assumed to be true, but never really looked into it. So, in the case of government, there is this assumption that I certainly had and were taught in schools that government is this benevolent entity that is designed to protect all of us. And in the Liberty book, and I go into this in the Reset book as well, well, what is government? Is it something that we need? Is it actually something that's protecting us? Can it be innately harmful? How would we function without it? And what I find is that it's almost like you can't unhear these ideas, whether the reader agrees with them or not. The ideas are there; these new possibilities open up, and I think there's value in that because it just leads to more creativity as the world shifts. There's a broader perspective that we can then use to evaluate problems.
Hmm. And part of that broader perspective that you're talking about, and this is again picked up in the themes in several of your books, at least the ones I've read, is things like decentralized life versus centralized authority, nationalism versus globalism. We're seeing this played out right now, it seems, with MAGA. And I want to get your take on this. I've come to see MAGA as a made in America global response to globalism. It's sort of a call to get back to the idea that local interests, local ideas, national pride, things of that nature are really important, and we've lost them somewhere along the way because we've become globally connected, and we're being drawn by people like Klaus Schwab into this idea that, oh well, things would be so much better if we just had a globalized central government. So just give up all of your liberty to us, and we'll take care of you. So this sort of nationalism versus globalism, that's another one of the themes that's treated in your books, isn't it?
Yeah, I tend to be much more in favor of decentralization of power because when power is centralized, that gives a few people an ability to do horrible things. Not that every politician is bad or malicious, but there certainly have been historically. And if the position is there where one person or a few people can control massive amounts of people, that could become a magnet for psychopathic type personalities, people
Hmm.
who are drawn to power in ways that most of us can't understand. So, in order to protect for that inevitability, decentralization will take away the possibility of that kind of tyranny. It's not perfect, but it's certainly better than centralization.
Hmm. And so let's take a real world example that's rather topical in Canada right now. You probably see where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
Donald Trump, who's who's going to be the next president of the United States very soon, has said that he wants to bring Greenland into the United States. He wants to really repatriate the Panama Canal, which actually belongs to America, if you know anything about the history of the Panama Canal. But he also wants to make Canada the 51st state. And the question sort of gives rise to this question. And, all this is going on while I'm reading your books. I'm thinking, well, what would Mark say? Is what Donald Trump doing? Is this an expression of American nationalism? Is he trying to secure the Western Hemisphere and protect us against globalism? Or is he expressing himself a form of globalism, a form of global imperialism by wanting to take over these other areas and make them part of the United States? What's your take on that?
Hmm. My caveat before answering is that I think it's very difficult for the general public to assess some of this stuff because
Yeah.
the information that we have is so limited, most likely relative to what the politicians are looking at. And
Yeah.
there's so much stuff probably happening behind the scenes. So what I'm going to give is an uninformed opinion. But I find it interesting, number one, that these ideas did not come out during campaigning. It was after the presidency was won that this expansionist mentality came in. So that's new, and it didn't come up. I don't remember it during the first term presidency.
Mhm.
But from my perspective, who is someone in favor of decentralization, one power taking up other land masses, that just goes against that principle. Are
Yeah.
there other strategic reasons where it actually might be a stabilizing force and might be beneficial? There could be reasons, but I would be much more in favor of countries breaking up into smaller entities where the local interests are controlled, rather than having a few people in the White House in Washington D.C. controlling people in a faraway land miles and miles away. You start getting into empire territory.
Right. Right. Interesting. But of course, the other side of the question is, okay, is it is Americanism, which America was very much engaged in exporting to the rest of the world during the 20th century, at least let's say the middle part of the 20th century. Is that something good for the rest of the Western world? I would say, on balance, yes. I don't think we could say that America has been an evil empire. Um, but at the same time, it raises the question: well, what would the world look like, if, if American manifest destiny was that America was going to control, most of the Western Hemisphere? Very interesting. Maybe that could be the topic of your eighth book. Keep that in mind, Mark.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And I know many people who are from Canada, and I've been following closely. Canada has been much more tyrannical than the US, especially during COVID and the truckers' convoy and what happened with the freezing of bank accounts.
Mhm.
And I mean, some really scary things, authoritarian things happening in Canada that we didn't quite see in America. So I could imagine for Canadians, this could be a very good thing. And I know in terms of the currency, there could be benefits too. But just from my perspective, as someone who tends to view government as an inherently tyrannical entity, when
Right.
governments are growing in a big way, that makes me concerned. That's always my knee-jerk reaction.
Hmm. And that's very well stated in your books. But talking about your most recent book, the one about the Great Reset, it really spoke to me because Canada has been living through. I mean, if you go to the World Economic Forum website, Mark, and you look at the basic principles, some of which you mention in your book, and then you look at the legislation that the Trudeau government has brought into existence over the past 9 years. It's seamless. You can basically overlay it. It's almost as though Canada has been a petri dish experiment for this globalism and for this great reset. In fact, Justin Trudeau during the pandemic went as far as to echo the comments of Klaus Schwab that this is an opportunity. He said Well, people were locked down in their homes. He said this is an opportunity for a great reset. But of course, Canadians don't want the great reset. There's something about us, freedom-loving Canucks. We actually want to own things. We actually want to be free. Is there something innate in human beings, do you think, that makes us want to have our possessions, have our homes, make us want to be free and live in families and live in communities? That seems to be one of the themes that comes through in your books.
I think that's true, that there's something innate within us that feels these qualities at some level. And that knowing can be drowned out after years of indoctrination and schooling and things like that, and media manipulation. But I do think we tend to desire to be free. I do think, however, that people can become complacent and not want to take responsibility for their lives and hope that the government will take care of things for them. It sounds much nicer when someone's going to do things for you. But
Mhm.
you're reminding me also of something Justin Trudeau said in his speech when he was talking about his stepping down, where
Right.
he said repeatedly that everything he's done has been in the best interest of Canadians.
Mm.
And we hear politicians say this all the time. But from my perspective, and this comes out especially in the Liberty book, when I talk about the Austrian School of Economics,
Right. Hmm.
even if he wanted to do things in the best interest of Canadians, how could he know what is in the best interest of Canadians? Each
Right.
of us is a unique being with subjective preferences in terms of the things we like and dislike. It's very subjective. Just think about people's dietary likes and dislikes and how they can change on a dime, where one day you like chocolate and the next day you're like, oh, no, I want strawberry. Think about all of the different things within a human being that we like and dislike and need and don't need. And to say, for a person to say that I'm going to do what's in everyone's best interest, that no one person can know what is in the best interest of others by
Hmm.
definition.
Hmm. And it's dangerous when the state comes in and tries to do that for us. You do a great job of explaining that in your books. The other thing you do a great job of explaining is what you just said about why that's true, why people have different, but scientific reasons, cultural reasons, historical reasons for why people want to have things their own way, why they want to be free, why we want to be prosperous, why we want to live in families, and why that's important to our sort of transcendent sense of meaning in our lives. And so there are questions in life that cannot be answered simply by the material world, that there's something beyond that that we all aspire to. Of course, this is the subject of Viktor Frankl's book, which is also mentioned, I think, in your book on liberty, or mentioned in one of the ones I read. I know for sure. But so that is something that coming back to your books again, I really appreciate it. Is I read a lot of these books, these nonfiction books, and all of them are great in their own ways. But one of the things that you take time to do is you talk about the problems, you talk about their sources, but you also talk about solutions. You talk about real world things that we can do as individuals and as communities to kind of make things, to improve things. And that's something you must have spent some time thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one thing to deconstruct a problem, that's very important, but getting stuck in problems can be toxic because then it's easy to become really negative. Whereas if there's a way out, or at least just an approach that could help us transcend the problems, it's more optimistic ultimately. So I do try to get there in all the books, doing both.
Hmm. The other thing that you've been involved in, and we're going to come back to some of the other books we haven't talked about yet when we go to our reading list, and all six of your books are going to be added to our reading list today, Mark, is your podcast, Where Is My Mind? You want to talk about this? What was the sort of the genesis of the podcast, and what do you try and do on that program?
When my first book was published, An End to Upside Down Thinking, that was 2018. Following that, I worked with a production company called Blue Duck Media, based in Los Angeles, to interview many of the scientists and experiencers that I wrote about in that book. So the series called Where Is My Mind covers the science of near-death experiences, psychic phenomena, the science of consciousness and the brain. I interviewed a Nobel Prize winner in physics, Dr. Brian Josephson, professors from the University of Virginia, from Princeton, many different places. And the podcast series is not just a long form conversation between me and the interviewee, like this one is. The
Hmm.
podcast is a conversation between me and my friend, who is the podcast producer, who is newer to the subject matter. And he's asking me questions that he thinks the audience would have. And I say, well, I talked to this scientist, and then we took clips from my interviews and put it in. And there's music in the background. So the podcast, Where's My Mind, has actually gotten more attention recently because there's another one called the Telepathy Tapes, which is now the #1 of all podcasts. It surpassed Joe Rogan recently. And many of
Wow.
the themes in that, including people I interviewed, are in that show. So it's kind of a similar format.
Hmm.
But my show, again, if your audience is interested, you can go on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. It's just 8 episodes, so it's a quick way to learn about some strange things about the nature of reality.
Are you still doing the podcast, or was it sort of a limited edition?
Yeah, it's a limited edition. It's episodes 1 through 8. It goes in chronological order. There's a sequence to it and a narrative, and we haven't done a second one.
Well, we'll have to look forward to the second one. It's on my list of things to do to listen to it. I definitely am now after the way you described it. It sounds really intriguing. Um, in terms of your other books, we really need to talk about a couple of these. One of them that hits very close to home uh, for this show in particular and for Canada is An End to Upside Down Medicine. This was a book that is the next one I plan to read in your catalog. I noticed I went on your X page and you posted something really interesting talking about a question that you asked of Chat GPT about the existence of a virus. I wonder if you could talk about that and then maybe relate that to the book that you wrote
Sure.
about
Yeah.
medicine.
An end to upside down medicine challenges the allopathic approach to medicine. And it does it in 2 primary ways. It looks at one of the core facets of allopathic medicine, which is the germ theory of disease. And there's a big section of the book looking at what is germ theory and why do scientists believe it exists and what are the problems. And then I tie in the nature of consciousness and how that I feel should be brought into health and well-being, because there's so many different case studies and some studies even suggesting that the allopathic approach is missing something huge in medicine. But to your question more specifically of what I've been doing with the AI systems, whether it's ChatGPT or Anthropic's Claude or Google's Gemini, is that I've got it to confess some pretty heavy things that I wrote about in the book.
I see that. Yeah.
And the confessions, you'll read about the details more in the book when you get to it. But there are real questions about the existence of any virus. And I know that sounds insane. I thought it sounded crazy when I first heard it, but I didn't understand the history of virology, of how did we even come to believe that there are viruses that make us sick? Because if we think about it, if people go to a party and a bunch of them get sick afterwards, they say, well, I caught something, they assume. But we
Right.
never actually see a particle going from one person to the other and infiltrating the cells and doing the parasitic things that we're told. And there's complex stuff that happens in a laboratory setting outside the body. And we're shown a picture and they say, well, that's it. And we're supposed to just believe it. But when you actually dig into the methodology, everything ties back in virology to the 1954 study. It's called the Enders and Peebles study. And John Franklin Enders is a Nobel Prize winner. And basically, this is the crux of it, that this was the foundational paper where the first virus was isolated using the current methodology that's now used to isolate other viruses. The trick is the word isolate traditionally means to separate one thing from all other things. So to use an analogy from Dr. Thomas Cowan, he says if you want to isolate a hammer from a toolbox, you take the hammer out of the toolbox, and then you can study and characterize that hammer, and you
Right.
can do all sorts of things with it, but you've got the hammer by itself.
Hmm.
Isolation in the context of the way it's done in virology is not that. It's indirect, where a sample from a person who's sick with something that the scientists presume must be a virus, those fluids from the sick person are taken from the person, and then they're put into a soup of material. It's called a cell culture. And
Hmm.
that soup has all sorts of stuff in it, antibiotics, monkey kidney cells, and lots of other things. And the scientists say, well, if we see cells breaking down in the cell culture soup After we add the fluids from a sick person, we found a virus.
Mm-hmm.
And that leaves out many other possibilities of why cells might be breaking down. And then every test that's done afterwards, whether it's an electron microscope image, if it's from an unpurified sample, or a genetic test, you don't have a purified sample of just a virus by itself. So we end up with real problems from a scientific perspective, because in order to run science, we need to have an independent variable.
Right.
And if we don't have a purified sample of just a virus, if there's other stuff in there potentially, then we don't have an independent variable. So we're by definition in the realm of pseudoscience. Not to mention there are not proper controls in these studies too. So that's the gist of it. It's more complex. But what I've done with AI is I've got it to admit that. And it will say things, well, it's really difficult to isolate in the way you're describing it. And then what I will do is I will show it information from Freedom of Information request responses that have been submitted around the world by Christine Massey from Canada and her colleagues. And they will ask for this. Can you provide, from the CDC and others, can you provide me any evidence, papers or otherwise, of a purified sample of just this virus, whether it's SARS-CoV-2 or HIV, any of them? And they will say, no, we have no records responsive to what you're saying. And in one case, I quote this in the book, what you're describing violates the gold standard of what we do in virology. So what I'm doing in this book, I'm really summarizing what many other doctors have been talking about, not just since COVID, actually. This came up during HIV. I didn't realize there's an organization called the Perth Group that was questioning this as well.
Right.
So there are real questions ultimately about why do we get sick? And that's the purpose of the book. It's not just about viruses. I'm interested in what makes someone healthy, because regardless of what we believe right now, all we know is that the system isn't working. It seems like we're guessing, and the methods are ultimately barbaric in the way that we're taking all sorts of medications and people aren't getting well. We don't really understand why some people get sick and others aren't. We're making a lot of guesses, and I try to drill down on that in the book.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm interested in reading that because it sounds as though what you're saying, if there's no such thing as a virus, that lands a rather large torpedo in the hull of the good ship pandemic. And of course, that ship is very important to the whole idea of the Great Reset. And so I can see kind of sort of some of the progressions of your ideas from that book to the Great Reset, which is really fascinating. Now, turning to another topic of a book that you have written, you've written a book called An End to the Upside Down Cosmos. And I think this would be a very interesting book that I'm looking forward to reading because, we've had so much talk about UFOs recently and what are these drones in New Jersey doing? So this looks like a really fascinating book. What was the impetus for writing that particular one?
I had heard many people questioning cosmology broadly. What is Earth? What's our place in the cosmos? Is there a Big Bang? And what I found is that, especially studying for the medicine book, I found certain doctors and researchers who had very clean, logical thinking, who were able to break down the flaws in what has been done. And I was finding that a large percentage of the people that I really respected in the medical domain were asking similar questions about cosmology and seeing similar logical fallacies in that realm. So I said, okay, I need to look into this. And when I looked into it, I found things that were both very disturbing, but also just fascinating. And what it comes down to with so many things, whether it's cosmology or medicine or anything, there's a logical fallacy. It's called affirming the consequent.
Right. Yeah.
This is how it goes, basically. When it rains, or if it rains, the grass outside will be wet. That's statement one. Statement two is the grass outside is wet, therefore it rained. The second statement is problematic because it assumes a cause. And this is what happens so often. We will see something that is compatible with a model and then assume that that model is the correct one. So just because a model can correctly predict one thing doesn't mean it's the correct model. And this is rampant, especially in cosmology. I'll just give you one teaser there. there has been a long debate in modern times, not as much of a debate, but historically, between heliocentrism and geocentrism. I learned about this, I remember, in high school. Geocentrism is Earth is at the center. That obviously tends to invoke much more of a spiritual or religious perspective, that we are the center of creation,
Hmm.
versus heliocentrism, which is the mainstream Copernican perspective, that Earth revolves around the sun. I never even thought to question this. Prior to looking at cosmology, I was asking, who are we? Why are we here? I wasn't asking, what is here? And this question is, well, are we at the center, or what, or where am I? And the teaser on this is that mainstream physicists like Albert Einstein, Stephen Hawking, I quote many in the book, admit this, that our observations of things in the sky cannot tell us whether heliocentrism is right or geocentrism, that there is a form of equivalence between the two just based on what we observe. And how, but there has been a philosophical preference. It's called the Copernican principle, which posits that we are not special, that Earth does not occupy any special place in the cosmos. That has been the view of so many of the scientists. And therefore, other observations that they've seen have been force fit into the heliocentric perspective, whereas they have not been considering the geocentric possibility as much. And what I
Hmm.
show in the book is there are reasons that we should be looking back at geocentrism, among other things.
Hmm. Well, there are also recent scientific discoveries, which I expect you talk about in the book, which tend to point to the idea that let's say geocentrism and heliocentrism are not necessarily in conflict. We had a brilliant author on the show recently, Spencer Clavin, who has written a wonderful book where he talks about the idea that in fact this historical tension between science and religion, shall we say, is somewhat artificial, and that there's a different way of looking at science and also looking at religion. And he points to examples, for example, the concept of fine tuning, which you're probably
Hmm.
familiar with, which is in many ways is a scientifically provable principle of physics, but it tends to support the idea that there was an intuitive, super intelligent being that designed the Earth for human beings. So it sounds as though there's the seeds of a lot of really interesting ideas in that particular book. But what do you think about that? Do you see science and religion really at odds, or are you more of the mind that actually some of the early scientists like Newton were right, that there's another way of looking at science as revealing the secrets of the natural world that have been placed there for us to discover over time? What do you think about that?
To me, science and religion are different ways of trying to explain reality, and therefore they are both valuable in that regard. But what's happened to science is that it's become scientism, and it's become dominated by materialism. Therefore, any results within science that do not conform to materialism are called pseudoscience, and they're brushed aside. And they say, well, that can't be true because that would mean that people who believe in certain religions are right, and that's not possible.
Hmm.
So I think there's a bit of dishonesty within the scientific community and even social engineering. There's a quote that I mentioned it in the Reset book. Mario Beauregard, a neurologist who is from Canada, and he worked at one of the premier neurological institutes in Canada. He was told by the head of that institute that as long as she's alive, he will never be able to study spiritual phenomena. And his conclusion was this is clearly social engineering. It's dark versus light. And what he's describing, I've talked to many scientists in this domain because this is where I started back in 2016 with the nature of consciousness. This happens in academia everywhere. There's some pressure from the top within the academic community, which is clearly a huge part of the scientific community, that is pressuring and biasing the science.
Yes. And one of the things you talk about it, one of the problems with that is when you get to the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset, that tends to open the door for people to talk in sort of in blasé fashion about, I don't know, reduction of 7/8 of the world's population. Uh, because it's when you take away that spiritual part of it, the transcendent part of human experience, and you just sort of buy into the concept that everything is material. Um, that becomes a very dangerous way of looking at the world, doesn't
Yeah, because humans become disposable.
it?
What does it matter if this number of people die if we can achieve this? That sort of ends justifies the means mentality can kick in within the authority structures if you don't have that the view of humans that each human being is an inherently spiritual, powerful, and important being. It's a very different perspective.
Hmm. I want to finish off by talking about your first book, which was an award winner, An End to Upside Down Thinking. Now, I haven't not read this one, but I get the impression that in this book, you lay down some of the foundations, maybe plant some of the seeds for the fruit of the topics that are explored in your subsequent books. Is that correct?
Yeah, my hope is that book for someone who actually reads the whole thing. I know some people who are more skeptical, they will stop reading pretty quickly, but to actually look at the whole body of evidence presented there, that it would be a nail in the coffin for materialism. And I'm summarizing the research of many brave scientists over many decades in that book. So the book is a challenge to scientific materialism ultimately, and it's through very various lenses, but primarily a scientific lens of looking at the science of near-death experiences, the science of telepathy, the science of psychokinesis, which is mind impacting matter, and many other phenomena. The argument that I make in the book and also the podcast, Where is My Mind, is sort of like a quick summary of all this, is that if there is one of these examples that is true, just one, materialism cannot accommodate it.
Mhm.
And that's what really matters to me. So because you'll get skeptics that come in and say, well, I don't like the way the methodology was done on this one study, or this was a meta-analysis and I don't like a meta-analysis. I want to see other things.
Mhm.
I haven't come across someone that can disprove all of it. Some of the arguments I've heard are, well, the statistics are too good. That can't be true. Or
Mhm.
they're hiding their negative results and things like that. But the first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, that's the one that I generally, if someone asks me where should I start, Mark, I tell people to go in chronological order, and An End to Upside Down Thinking is the first one. But there are still a lot of people who get very triggered by it.
Mhm. Well, I talked about the careful way in which you construct these books, and it's obvious that there's symmetries even within sort of looking at the books. Collectively, there's different themes that are brought up. There's one example that you talk about in the Great Reset book that I think really illustrates, the difference between this material world and transcendent world. And I'm paraphrasing this a little bit. You'll correct me if I get the story wrong, but you were talking about patients in hospitals, who are in hospital and have no brain, basically have very little brain activity. They're in a coma, for example, and they talk about out of body experiences where they describe seeing things from a perspective which would be impossible for them to have in terms of the material world, but they have very distinct memories. And you talk about how scientists are able to test they're able to verify, I think that's the right word, the authenticity of those memories. And yet, scientifically, these people had no brain activity that would support them having like a dream that would cause this type of a memory. And I thought that was a very particular example showing sort of this tension or this distinction between the material world and the transcendent. Did I get that story wrong, or you want to flesh that out a little bit for people?
Yeah,
Because I think that's
that's
a very that really struck me the way you described that.
Yeah, you summarized it very well. What I was describing is a certain type of out of body experience that's often reported in a near death experience state. A near death experience is when a person has an expanded state of consciousness while they're in physiological distress, in some cases, cardiac arrest or clinical death.
Mhm.
And yet their consciousness, their ability to perceive, is
Right.
somehow outside of their body, and they are seeing and hearing things from a vantage point outside their body, often above the body or sometimes down the hall. And then they're resuscitated and they come back once they're healthy
Mhm.
again, and they're able to tell the doctor and family members things that happened at the time. And the doctors and family members can verify it. So that means it wasn't a hallucination. And the doctors can go back at the records and know what the physiology of the body and brain were doing at the time because they know what the memory was. You can timestamp it. So these are known as veridical out of body experiences. They're discussed also in the podcast, Where is My Mind, with the researchers themselves. But these to me are extremely powerful because you have a verified memory at a time that the brain shouldn't be capable of producing anything complex, let alone a memory from outside the body.
Mhm.
And one of the issues is that these are difficult things to document. I mean, often a person who's having a near-death experience, the doctor's just trying to save them,
Mhm.
let alone you're trying to document these sorts of things in an emergency situation. But there is a book called The Self Does Not Die. And there was a revised version that came out recently that has even more cases. But it goes through the cases that have been well documented of these verified perceptions during near death experiences. If there's even one of these, this should never happen, yet there are many that have been reported.
Yeah, truly remarkable. Well, there you have it, folks. That's just one example of the remarkable stuff you're going to find in these books. I highly recommend them. They're extremely readable, really fascinating books, all of them. Auto reading list. All of Mark's books are going to be added to our reading list. Well, Mark, uh, the last question for you is sort of give you the final word. We always ask our guests, are there any particular works that you have read? It could be in a literature or a podcast or website or some source of information that's been meaningful for you, uh, one that you have not written, uh, that you think you would recommend for people that they should go to and read or experience?
Well, since this conversation, at least initially started with politics, I would say the work of Murray Rothbard,
Oh, yes. Yeah.
especially his book For a New Liberty, which came out in the early 70s. There's an organization that I would recommend to your audience because there are a number of free resources that you can find, free downloadable books. It's called the Mises Institute, MISES.org. And you can go to their free resources and find many books by Murray Rothbard and read them there, and also other philosophers of a similar ilk like Hans Hermann Hoppe and Tom DiLorenzo, who's the president now. Some really great work there that to me was extremely mind expanding.
Mhm. Well, thank you for that recommendation. We're going to provide those links to people in the show. And thank you for your books. This is really a treasure trove that you are creating. It's a great legacy for people. And I love what you're doing, where you're taking these really complex, important ideas and you know bringing them to the people in a way that that they can appreciate and understand them, and also the empowering aspect of your books, which gives people practical ideas about things that they can do, that they can think about, they can do every day to make a difference. So I want to thank you for your work and wish you much continued success with everything that you're doing. The seventh and eighth book, which I gave you the idea for. And just want to thank you so much for being our special guest here today on Gray Matter.
Well, thank you so much for the kind words, and I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for having me.